I'd like to say thank you to the Dock Street Theater team as we manage what feels like a complex production. I am Amanda Bagdonis, the production and operations manager, so thank you. New this year, we have merchandise, we have hats, we have shirts, we have coffee mugs, and more while supplies last. And I'd also invite you to check out Buxton Books in the box office area. Peter Crane has already signed some books, and he can personalize them for you in the box office after this session. We also have another important sponsor, Alla and Ralph Isham. And what a fitting sponsor, as the prints on Ava's clothing are from Alla's own painted canvases, and she takes them and puts them on the printed clothing. It's her take on what makes life pleasurable, colorful, and fun. And since we're in the business of promoting, 20% of all proceeds this month from your purchase at Ava will go to Charleston Literary Festival. We are now entering our 5th day of the festival, and I've begun to meet some of you and notice that you are an eclectic bunch with many interests and hobbies and pastimes. And much like the subject of Peter Crane's forthcoming book on Rory McEwen, he was a painter, a musician, a sculptor, and a television presenter. And why wouldn't he be all of those things? Rory McEwen, A New Perspective on Nature, will travel to some select venues across the USA, and it is opening down the street from us at the Gibbes Museum of Art in January of 2024. So to introduce Peter Crane, he is president of the Oak Spring Garden Foundation in Virginia. It's an estate of Rachel Lambert Mellon, and it includes my favorite combination, an incredible garden and an extensive library. This one focused on the history of plant science, exploration, and the development of gardens and landscape design. Just as we encourage conversation here at Charleston Literary Festival, the foundation is dedicated to inspiring and facilitating public dialogue on the uses, history, and future of plants, including their importance for our well-being. Peter Crane is known internationally for his work on the diversity of plant life, from origins to fossil history, current status, conservation, and use. Let's go ahead and give him a round of applause. This afternoon, Peter will be in conversation with his friend and our board member, Laura Gates. Laura has served as a Southern Environmental Law Center board chair whose mission is to protect the basic right to clean air, clean water, and a livable climate, to preserve our region's natural treasures and rich biodiversity, and to provide a healthy environment for all. Ms. Gates serves as the director for the Preservation Society of Charleston. She is a former chair of the Coastal Conservation League, past vice president of the Field Museum of Natural History, and former principal with Mackenzie & Company. She is the former chair of the Carolina Art Association, Gibbes Museum of Art, and the former chair of the Board of Trustees at Wellesley's College. Welcome, Peter and Laura.
A behind-the-scenes look at Oak Spring, and that's where we're going to start. Peter is going to take you on a tour, and after which I have a few questions for him, and then we'll leave some time for you to ask questions too. So while Peter makes his way to the podium, I'll just make an important literary reference. This is, after all, a literary festival. And after an already distinguished career that you've heard about, including being head of the environmental school at Yale and the director at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, Sir Peter Crane, fellow of the Royal Society, fell in the honey pot. And that's what he's going to talk to you about. No, that would be A.A. Milne.
Laura, thank you very much, and thank you all very much indeed for coming this afternoon. As Laura said, I want to introduce you to this wonderful estate at the Oak Spring Garden Foundation, tell you a little bit about the Mellons, and tell you a little bit about what we're doing now. And while I could do that without any illustrations, it'll be much better when you see the pictures. So I'm going to go through this quite fast. I hope I can speak for just 25 minutes or so, and then, as Laura said, we'll get on to the questions and discussion. So starting with Paul Mellon. Paul Mellon, one of the great American philanthropists, his real passion was for horses and art. And, okay, sorry, there we go. His real passion was for horses and art, and probably his most famous racehorse was Mill Reef, that raced mainly in the UK. Among the many gifts, wonderful gifts that Paul Mellon left us all, he was concerned with land conservation, the National Gallery of Art, founded by his father, Andrew W. Mellon, the Yale Center for British Art, the Virginia Museum of Fine Art, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and much, much more. Bernie Mellon had a passion for plants and gardens, and the estate that we manage now is here in the Virginia Piedmont, and she's perhaps best known for her relationship with the Kennedys, and particularly the invitation from President Kennedy to redesign the garden, the West Garden at the White House, that we now know as the Rose Garden. So she did this, and the Rose Garden obviously is an important space for us nationally, and the Kennedy connection certainly still looms large at Oak Spring. And while many of the contents of Mrs. Mellon's home were sold after her death, one of the things that was missed in the auction was that little framed picture on the back of the bookcase there. And when we discovered it, if you turn it over, it says on the back, I just show it, these flowers collected by Perry Wheeler from Flowers, RLM, Rachel Lambert Mellon, picked in the Rose Garden to make a basket of flowers for President Kennedy's grave on the day of his funeral at the request of Mrs. Kennedy. So that connection is still very live and an important one for us. And among the Kennedy connections are these two incredible plant portraits by Rory McEwen, who was just mentioned. Mrs. Mellon bought these in the early 60s, and she lent them to the Kennedy White House for display, and they will be part of the exhibit that starts here at the Gibbes in January. Rory McEwen, as you've heard, was absolutely a fascinating character, and the quality of his botanical art is really kind of unsurpassed. And this exhibit not only features his art, but also features art from several collections, but particularly the Mellon collection, showing how he was influenced by the remarkable botanical artists that went before him. So you see here an example from the 17th century alongside Rory McEwen's depictions of 19th century English florist tulips. So the exhibit, as I said, will open at the Gibbes in January. So the importance of the foundation today is really to steward the legacies of Mrs. Mellon. And as you've heard, we're sort of focused on scholarship and public engagement around plants, gardens, and landscapes, particularly bringing together some of the disciplines that perhaps ordinarily wouldn't speak to each other. I'll talk a little bit about the assets of the foundation, but one of the important assets is the landscape. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is to understand the history of that landscape from its Native American occupation through its colonial history, its slave-based agricultural landscape, the Civil War, and through to where it became, during Paul Mellon's time, a real center for equestrian activities of all kinds. So we're concerned about the landscape and how we might restore that to something approximating a native ecosystem. We're concerned as much about the wonderful animals, like this lovely short-eared owl, and the bobolinks, rare meadowland birds, and some of the mammals. The otters that we have in the stream and the foxes are all part of the landscape that we manage. But we're also focused very much on plants, and so we couldn't really operate in the world of plants without thinking about the world of food. So we established what we call the Biocultural Conservation Farm on Mrs. Mellon's former cut flower garden, and that provides a community-supported agriculture program all through 25 weeks of the summer. And our rule is that we want to donate 50% of what we grow to local food banks. Last year, we grew about 40,000 pounds of vegetables. 30,000 went to local food banks. The garden also supports the work of artists who come, artists and scholars and scientists who come to the Oak Spring Garden Foundation to pursue their work. I could show you lots of lovely examples, but I just show you one, the wonderful work of Hilary Walters Fail, who does these incredible embroidery on these leaves. Mrs. Mellon was interested in plants from an very early age. She was influenced by her maternal grandfather and also her father, who was a very interesting character, known, among other things, for the marketing of Listerine. And he encouraged her interest. She never went to college, but he encouraged her interest in plants and gardens from an early stage. This was one of the first books that she owned, A Flower Guide to Wildflowers East of the Rockies. And as a teenager, she began to purchase books related to plants, gardens, and libraries. This is Ferber's The Garden Displayed. She also designed and painted her own gardens as a teenager, and we now see the fullest expression of that at Oak Spring. And so just a few slides of the garden to give you a sense of the place. It's a walled garden. Great idea when you have an overpopulation of deer, by the way. And it's set out in a number of terraces, and it's really a beautiful garden with many different facets, including this wonderful little bothy spring garden. The bulbs are going in right now. It's really a beautiful space, and it has associated with it a formal glass house, which you see the inside of here. And our most important horticultural feature is this incredible crabapple arbor. And, this is really a pretty wonderful thing. And it takes, I think it's interesting to reflect on Mrs. Mellon's character. I mean, you can't create something like this overnight. You have to have a kind of long view. So this is what it looked like in 1960 when she planted it. And here's an aerial view of it today. It's really remarkable. But perhaps the singular asset that we have on the site in terms of its real importance is the library. And the library is a freestanding building built in two phases, designed by Larrabee Barnes. And it's really a very special space. So here you see the main library room full of these incredible books and some really important works of art. The Rothko there, I like to say that she had the wall, she had the Rothko before she had the wall. In other words, she created this building in part to house that incredible painting, which we now have a replica of. And you can see how she used the place. I mean, I've never had the courage to light a fire in the library, but Mrs. Mellon didn't think twice about that opportunity. It's really a remarkable space, and almost all of the more than 100 scholars that we have coming to the site every year use the library in some shape or form. And everywhere you look inside that building, it's exquisitely designed. And the art is pretty wonderful, too. I mean, this is one of my all-time favorite representations of tulips. This is by Van Spondonk from the 18th century. Here, somewhat earlier, from the 16th century, is this copy of Mattioli. It's a deluxe 16th century copy of Mattioli, printed on blue paper with the images outlined in silver and in some cases gold. And what I think is really fascinating about this work is that we have another work from the early 18th century that used exactly the same woodblocks, but only 200 years later. So this is Henri Louis Duhamel de Monceau, and what's even more incredible is that we have 3 of those woodblocks in the library today. We have some astonishing things. At one point in my life, I thought I might write a book on the Venus flytrap, which is a very interesting plant and one that's relevant to this part of the world. I said to Tony, do we have that article, by John Ellis, where he describes the Venus flytrap? He said, no, I don't think we have that. But we do have Ellis's original handwritten manuscript and drawing of the Venus flytrap, which is really an astonishing treasure. And many, many other things. Wonderful botanical art by women botanical artists through the centuries, from Maria Sibylla Merian, this incredible Dutch woman who traveled to Suriname in the late 1600s, Elizabeth Blackwell, who painted these images while her husband was in prison to support herself and her family, Dorothea Eliza Smith, who was with her husband in Lima, Peru in the 19th century, painting flowers of the Lima market, and Elsie Margaret Stones, who my wife Eleanor and I knew at Kew, who painted for several decades for the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, who Mrs. Mellon commissioned to produce a few paintings for her. And eclectic things like these amazing paintings by Sophie Granval. And the topic that's displayed here is one that's very close to Mrs. Mellon's heart. She used the library in addition to collecting those books, and she was extremely interested in the manipulation of woody plants. And she used particularly this book by Noisette on the fruit garden. And it's all about pruning and grafting and how you manipulate woody plants to produce something, for example, like this. And as you walk around the Mellon estate, you see there it is in practice. So these candelabra espaliers with their wonderful apples, or in the winter you see the shapes of the trees, which our landscape team still prune in exactly the same way every year. And then when they come into flower, they're really pretty special. And then in the garden itself, you see this 3-tiered holly, which is the same generation of probably the same plants that were planted in the East Garden of the White House. And she used these evergreens very strategically, positioning them in the landscape so that they formed real points of focus. I'll just show you a few pictures. Here's one, for example, as the sun goes down. Here's another one viewed from the living room. And then, of course, she's most well known for the creation of these astonishing topiaries and, obviously, this astonishing arbor. Her tastes in art influenced Paul Mellon, and I'm sure his tastes in art influenced her too. They collected all sorts of astonishing art, from Dutch masters to, as I said, Sophie Granval, or this astonishing Prince Doe. And they lived with that art in the house. I think that in the 90s, I think there were 5 Van Goghs in the house. And also part of the house is this, in a little inside a cupboard that hides the television set, is this trompe-l'oeil. And this trompe-l'oeil was painted by an English artist, Martin Battersby, and it's really about Paul Mellon, and it contains many of the kind of classic trompe-l'oeil motifs, the sands of times running out, the ephemeral life of a butterfly, and so on. Mrs. Mellon had one too. Hers was a little larger. This is the central space in that formal greenhouse at the end of the arbor, Paul Mellon was an Anglophile. His painting was painted, as I said, by Battersby, an English artist. She was a Francophile, and Fernand Renard painted hers. And just to kind of make a point about this, I mean, I don't think that Edward Larrabee Barnes would have designed a library like that without Mrs. Mellon's input. And I know that the greenhouse trompe-l'oeil would not have been the same if Renard had done it alone and she had had no input. This is one of the early maquettes that he sent her. By the time the next set of maquettes came, the color had changed, more things were on the shelves. Here's another one. Here's this one. This, I think, is a sort of final maquette, and if you keep your eye on that central portion at the top there, this is what it turned out to be. So she was adding materials, personalizing this during the process of production, which I'm sure was an entertaining thing for the artist who was charged with delivering it. But so many personal touches, you know, a little basket of letters addressed to her, something from her library imagined, pulled out of the book. And yeah, we have this book outside, and yeah, it's really pretty wonderful. And sometimes you have to look at it and say, is that towel real, or is that towel part of the trompe-l'oeil? So she was involved in the artistic process, and I think that's an important point. And another good example is the finial. The finial on top of the formal glass house central vestibule there was designed by the famous jewelry designer, Jean Schlumberger. And we have the sketches, and so we can see the various iterations of those sketches as they eventually came to produce this astonishing flower basket finial. Well, I promised I'd talk for 25 minutes. I think I've been talking for 24. And I just want to finish by saying what a privilege it is to be at Oak Spring and to have the opportunity of guiding the foundation in its formative years. And what a wonderful voyage of discovery it's been. And I'll just close with a couple of items. This is an English-Chinese dictionary made in 1773, never published, by an English trader in Canton. Just one of the incredible items in the library. When we arrived at Oak Spring, the picture on the left is what was in the basket house, a big pile of baskets. And the picture on the right is how we now use that. We used it as a kind of little conference room. So we've had the opportunity to work through all of those baskets and discover what they're all about. And the same in the linen closet on the left there and on the right. I think my wife's been down in the basement for about a year with a couple of volunteers working on the linen closet. And to just one final example, in the sale, I think it was nothing from the garden was supposed to go, but this sculpture went, and we were terribly sad about missing the maiden and the unicorn. There it was with its plinth, until we had literally been there 6 years when one of the old gardeners said, there's a box up in the attic. And lo and behold, it had a second copy of the maiden and the unicorn, which we've now put in place. So thank you for coming this afternoon. I hope you've enjoyed this glimpse into the Oak Spring estate and just a little of what we're doing. And as Mrs. Mellon said, is part of creating is understanding that there's always more to do and nothing is ever completed. Thank you.
So, Mrs. Mellon obviously had a vision and lived in a fabulous life in a fabulous place. You've contributed so much and brought so many new programs to Oak Spring. I mean, we listened to this presentation and it feels like well, she left this, and this is how it was, but it wasn't like that. So I want you to talk about some of the projects you've undertaken, and which ones have been maybe the most fun or the most challenging.
Yeah. Well, I think something that I omitted to say is that Mrs. Mellon lived a long and very full life, and she died on 17th of March 2014 at the age of 103. So she lived a very long life. Her husband had passed away about 15 years earlier. And so inevitably, when one gets to that age, it's hard to kind of, as one's world gets smaller, it's hard to think about the breadth of the estate, the other homes that she had, and so on. So I think, as we came in, a very important part of what we've been doing is a lot of capital projects. We had a lot of deferred maintenance to address. We had no office space to run a program from, so we had to create that. We had no space to have a lecture or a presentation. There was no table in the library that we could set out materials on in a large scale. So part of it was undertaking those capital works. But then the question was, okay, now how are we going to activate, this astonishing resource? So we initially thought, and we did host, and we still host occasional workshops and conferences. But we've moved to a model now where we host, on the Oak Spring side, residential classes. And some of those might be on 600 years of botanical illustration. Some of them might be on understanding the Piedmont landscape. Some of them might be on ancient trees. Some of them might be on environmental writing. So that's a kind of a stock thing that we have now. Lots of small programs, walks, butterfly walks, bird walks, and so on. And then we purchased from Mrs. Mellon's estate the Rokeby property, which is adjacent to the property that we started with, which was the original property that Paul Mellon and his father bought in Virginia. And what came with that was a bunch of employee houses. And we've renovated all of those, and we now have a program of visiting artists, visiting poets, musicians, conservation biologists, scientists, who can come to Oak Spring for 5 weeks, usually in cohorts of about 8, to try and have some of those conversations and to get on with their work. So, there's been a lot of learning by doing, I would say, but it's been pretty fulfilling. We had over 1,000 applications for our residencies for 2024 this year. And actually, we're right in the middle now of making those final decisions.
I'm curious, one of the commitments of your career has been to conservation. And I wonder how this fits specifically with that commitment. This is a different kind of choice because it's about libraries, and all these things are things that you've always been involved in, but this commitment to conservation is particular.
Yeah, it's, I feel like I've had a very privileged life in the sense that I've been able to pursue things that I've found interesting. I've also felt on the other side that there was also some responsibility there. And I think being concerned with plants, the responsibility for me came back to kind of plant conservation and how one thinks about it. So, in Chicago, we were involved in the beginning of Chicago Wilderness. It's kind of a regional effort. At Kew, we were very much involved in the Millennium Seed Bank, which was a global effort for plant conservation. And through that, I became involved in the Global Crop Diversity Trust, another global effort. At Yale, I really felt that the contribution there was the 150 students that were released on the world every year to go and do things in the environmental space. And then at Oak Spring, I think it's back to the kind of local which is how we're going to manage that 700 acres. And you can go to a lot of international meetings, and you can have a lot of high-level discussions, but at the end of the day, the action is taking place on the ground. Somebody's got to do it. So I really feel that we have to think carefully, and we are thinking carefully about how we manage the 700 acres that we have for the different aspects of what's left of the ecology in that area, and how we can do that. It's a very interesting. I mean, it was a thoroughbred horse farm with all of the grasses are ones very familiar to me from Europe. They're not native Piedmont grasses. So part of it is thinking about how we might do that restoration, which is a lot harder than it looks, particularly if you don't want to use a lot of herbicide. Part of it is also thinking about the birds and the kinds of habitats that they prefer. Some of our most endangered birds actually do quite well in those European pasture grasses. So understanding that and not ruining the situation by trying to fix something that isn't broken in that case. So it's a little complicated, and but I think the opportunity to kind of focus locally and actually do something practical is what's attractive about it, at least the current setup.
Well, this idea about your commitment to local food banks is also interesting to me, and I thought you might talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we, as I mentioned, we have this community-supported agriculture program, and I think it's developed very well. I mean, we grow a lot of unusual vegetables. I would like to see us doing more on the kind of heirloom varieties and endangered varieties, but on the other hand, I can't criticize my team because they doing such a fabulous job, and they are working on a certain amount of seed saving, which I see as kind of important, because we all tend to focus on a very narrow range of cultivars, and it's important that that diversity is retained because all of our crops are in an arms race with the pests, and we need that genetic variability to bring back into our crops, to whether it's drought or pest resistance or carbon sequestration, whatever. That variety is important.
Interesting. So I can't not ask questions about Q, because Q's Q. And so one of the things I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about was the Queen's 80th birthday at Q.
Well,
and the fireworks that fell on the glass houses.
Well, tomorrow you're going to hear from Lucy Worsley, who's from Historic Royal Palaces. And I mention that because on the Kew estate, which was some 300 acres, there were two buildings that we were not in control of. One was Kew Palace, which was one of the palaces that George III lived in during his time at Kew, and the other was Queen Charlotte's cottage. And since then, we've moved some more of the Kew buildings onto Historic Royal Palaces, who are really much better at looking after heritage buildings than a bunch of botanists are. But Kew Palace was being renovated. It's an extraordinary building. It's a small, intimate building, and the renovation was just complete. Her Majesty the Queen came up to her 80th birthday. So the Prince of Wales, now King Charles, decided that that would be where they would hold the family celebration. And so it was a magnificent evening, preceded by a great deal of security, that brought the whole close family together, 20 or so, for a party in this building, and the family all arrived one by one. They went into the palace. The Queen somehow was brought around the back. And so then they all came out of the front door, and the Queen then was with them. And then there was this enormous firework display. They were all standing there on the steps of Kew Palace. So yeah, that's one of our most treasured memories. And I just wish I could have spent more time in that building. I did get a last-minute tour of the inside of the building before they actually arrived. But as you can imagine, security was tight. We were all a bit edgy. And I didn't have time to examine that harpsichord that Handel had played on and various other things that I would have loved to have done. But it was a very special evening.
And I thought that was the palace where King George, when he had his episodes.
He was often at Kew, and towards the end of that time, he was mainly at Windsor. But he was, sequestered at Kew for some of that time. There's only, the Kew Palace that's there is actually only part of a much larger palace complex that existed there. But yeah, it was a very important a piece of his life. It was the joining together of two estates, one that he inherited from his mother and one that he inherited from his grandfather, his father having predeceased his grandfather. So, it was an important part of his life. He learnt that his grandfather had died while he was at Kew, so he became the monarch at Kew. And he was kind of engaged in these wonderful plants. And at that time, plants were coming into Kew from all over the world. So Joseph Banks, who'd been on Cook's first voyage to Australia, was sort of advising the king on the development of that garden. So it really was a kind of center for growing plants and
An empire. And because the empire was these plantations all over in the...
Absolutely, all over the world. And if you read the recent biography of George III, a lot of it takes place at Kew.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit because all of these botanic artists, he went through a whole series of women, and I know there's a whole series of women at Kew too. Can you talk about, are they all women? I mean, why do women excel in this form of art when they were precluded from so much other?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a kind of a long tradition that this is a genteel activity. At Kew, we had women gardeners quite early, but certainly, it's interesting when you look at the art in our library. I mean, there are some really standout women artists. Some of them I mentioned, Maria Sibylla Merian, for example. But in many cases, that work, some of the work was being done by men, and then the hand coloring was being done by women. This continued well into the 19th century. And so at least Joseph Dalton Hooker was having his daughter, hand color some of this incredible art. We published a small book a couple of years ago called The Royal Lessons, and this was actually written. It's in French, and it was written by a woman in France, and it was a kind of a how-to manual for how you would color these, how you would mix the paints, how you would apply the color. It's really a fascinating work, and I think it does illustrate, how engaged women were in this process of production, even if they weren't doing the first pass at the art. They were often doing the hand coloring.
So I also want to ask you, one of Peter's books, and I don't know whether it's out there, but it's out there, it's called Ginkgo. When Peter and I worked together, we often talked about kind of charismatic mammals. And if you're a botanist, you get a little annoyed about how everybody's always focusing on the tigers and the elephants and everything. And so we used to talk about charismatic plants. And I know you mentioned the flytrap, and ginkgo was one, and that, what's it called?
Welwitschia.
Yeah, that one. How'd you pick ginkgo over those others?
Yeah, I hate to say it, but it's a very tactical decision. I wanted to write a book that allowed me to talk about a variety of different things, and I wanted to have a single thread running through it. So I wanted something that allowed me to talk about kind of evolutionary biology. I wanted to have something that allowed me to talk about the fossil record. I wanted something that allowed me to talk about climate change over time, something that allowed me to talk about conservation. And ginkgo, by the way, is a really great good news story as opposed to a bad news story, because it almost went extinct. And the fact that we have it growing here in Charleston is because it formed an association with people about 1,000 years ago, and we've all come to love it. And so we found it useful and we planted. And then I wanted something where I could talk about medicinal properties of plants. I wanted something where I could talk about the way we think about who owns plants. There's a line in that book where I say, ginkgo is a gift to the world from China, but ginkgo is also a gift from the world to China, in the sense that it was widespread all over the planet, and particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, and it just happened to survive in China, and now, through its association with people.
You mean back in geologic time?
I mean, not so long ago, in geological time. A few tens of thousands of years ago, or even 10 million years ago, it was, we had ginkgo in Western North America, we had it in Europe. It was wide, we even, a little further back, it had it in the Southern Hemisphere. And 60 million years ago, it looked exactly the same as it looks today. Interesting question. Why didn't it change? But it very nearly went extinct, not because of people, because the climate changed. And then because people found it useful, first as a nut tree, and then eventually as a street tree, as an interesting ornamental, and as an interesting botanical megaflora, charismatic megaflora. It's now has no danger of going extinct.
Interesting. So you're going to write one on that, which
on which?
This is an unbelievable plant that grows in Namibia, right?
It grows in Namibia. Yeah, I don't. I'm not sure I have another one in me. We'll have to see.
So you've worked at a lot of collecting institutions, and I was thinking about our time together at the Field Museum, and then you went to Kew, and you remember when Thomas Hoving left the Metropolitan, he wrote that book, Making the Mummies Dance?
Yeah.
I think you made these institutions dance in a lot of ways, because you made them do things that they maybe didn't want to do, or some of the people in them didn't want to do. And so I'm thinking, what is the thing maybe at each place that you wished you'd gotten to that you didn't get to?
It's interesting. Well, as I said in the talk, I mean, it's never over, right? I mean, there's always more to do. So, I think of the Field Museum. I felt like there could have been more substance in the educational programs. I felt at Kew, there's so much obviously, but I think one thing I would say about Kew is that, Kew is there because it's on the river. It's on the Thames, just like all of these other wonderful things. Hampton Court, Tower of London, they're all on the Thames. Kew sort of turned its back on the river sometime in the 19th century, and I always felt that it should turn around again and face the river and embrace the river. And then at Yale, as at many universities, the environment is a really important and interesting topic. The undergraduates are crying out for it. And so the question then for universities is how they reorganize themselves, given that they've got geology departments, botany, biology departments, sociology departments, et cetera, et cetera. The environment cuts across all of those things. So how do you develop an environmental curriculum for the undergraduates that brings in all of these different, a policy perspective, a legal perspective, a business perspective, a biological perspective? How do you design a curriculum to do that? And so I think that's a work in progress at Yale, and I think it's a work in progress at many of our great universities.
Interesting. Well, I think it's time maybe to take your questions. So we've got lots of things. We got royal gossip. We got gossip about royals in Virginia. We got, well, witcha. So there's any number of things that Peter can address. We have questions? Gardens? Here we have
Couple of mics.
we have some mics coming
That's one right here.
right here.
On a selfish note, are you going to have any plans to make it easier for people to tour the gardens?
Tour the garden.
Oh, yes. We are open. In fact, I've got a little leaflet outside which tells you the dates when we're open. I think the neighbors were perhaps a little concerned about what would happen to the estate. And so we went through a process, a planning process, essentially, where it was no longer a private home, and now it was a foundation. And so in that process, it was specified by the planners how often we could be broadly open to the public. And actually, we went and got this expanded a little bit, so that just before the pandemic. So we're allowed to be open to the general public 4 times a year on the Little Oak Spring side. And so we're always part of Virginia Historic Garden Week. That's part of our process. And we will open twice in June this year. And then in the fall, we'll have the opportunity to open the kind of biocultural conservation farm, which is not encumbered by those same restrictions. But we're always giving tours of one sort or another to groups who will write in. So we have some flexibility. And I think the neighbors just didn't want a flood of coaches. And I had that at Kew, by the way. I mean, we had 1.3, well, when I started, we had 800,000 visitors at Kew. By the time I finished, it was 1.3 million visitors at Kew. And there were coaches and buses, and yeah, the neighbors can get agitated about that.
We know about that. There's a question down here.
Do you want?
Okay, you got
It.
Oh. And there's
I'm
one
having
here.
trouble seeing people, so I'm sorry.
Can you hear me? I'm involved with an historic property that has the oldest oldest known landscape gardens in America. And we have many of the challenges of deferred stuff that happens in gardens and buildings and all of the above. And my first question to you is, did she leave you a huge endowment that enables you to not have to open to 1.3 million people or whatever?
Yes. So the short answer to that is we have got a wonderful endowment. Mrs. Mellon was not prescriptive about what she wanted. She expressed a general hope of what she wanted to her wonderful lawyer, who then made it happen. And so one might say, well, it would have been nice to keep that Rothko, but on the other hand, if the Rothko hadn't been sold, I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now. So we do have, I mean, you always need more, but I mean, we have enough to run the operation, and we've had to kind of work our way through, one thing at a time. We couldn't do it all at once, obviously. But I think in a way that the really interesting question that you raise is, how do you manage a historic garden, given that the world is changing around it, the plants grow up and die, and we've had to face that. And so we commissioned a study by Ome van Sweden to look at the roughly 60-year history of the Mellon tenure in that garden, to try to understand how it had developed over time, what she was thinking when she did certain things. And so now, in June 22nd, 2022, we had a huge storm, and we lost a bunch of really big trees. So we're using that plan now to help us understand what we should put back. And it's been very interesting because your first reaction is to put back what you've just lost. But when you understand the history and how that came to be, you understand that that might actually not be the right solution. So you're looking at the past, and you're also thinking about the future and how the climate might change and so on. So
Can you do a specific?
it's been fascinating to focus on the garden and think about how that is being managed over time.
Well, we have camellias that were brought in by Andre Michaud.
Yeah.
And so with climate change, you have to think, what is the future going to bring, hopefully way down the road. But, you want to stick to an historic plant material. Anyway, I could go on and on. I'll pass the mic.
It's a very interesting question and no easy answers.
Okay, I've got a really superficial question. We all have favorites. Oh, sure.
Oh, sorry.
We all have favorites. I'm kind of curious because I know Bunny Mellon had favorites, but I'm curious about you. And if you had to pick a cultivated flower that was your favorite, pick one flower in Virginia that is your favorite flower, and then pick one indigenous flower in Virginia that's your favorite.
Yeah. In terms of the introduced plant, I'll go with gardenias. And the reason that I go with gardenias is because I delved into the history of gardenia a little bit. And the guy who was in China who was doing that English-Chinese dictionary, he was interested in gardenia. But he was interested in gardenia not for the flower, but for the fruit, because the fruit yields a bright red dye. And gardenia was actually introduced into England from the Cape. And what's it doing in the Cape? Well, the Dutch had already managed to bring it from the Far East and had it growing in the Cape. Then it was introduced into the UK. So anyway, there's a fascinating story around gardenia about what we usually grow as the double gardenia, which rarely produces a fruit. If you get the single gardenias, then they produce the fruit, that gives you the red dye. That's what they're interested in. So gardenia, that's my I mean, in terms of native plants, I mean, there are so many. I think, I mean, I could say lady slipper orchids and so on. I mean, there are so many. But one of the ones that I really love, which curiously enough was not on the Mellon estate, even though it's everywhere, is redbud. And I love it because in Chicago, when the redbud started to come into flower, I knew that the winter was almost over.
Okay. Here we go. Yeah, we'll get you.
Hello. I don't want to stand up.
Stand up.
I just wanted to say, as I was getting ready to get up in the morning, first thing I do is read the paper. And I read that the king had just done his first speech to Parliament. And we all know that he is very much in favor of environmental causes. But he had to read the speech that the Prime Minister wrote for him.
Yeah.
And we all know that the Prime Minister is very conservative. And in the speech, he had to talk about how they wanted to develop more oil drilling in the Baltic. Isn't it the Baltic? Or North Sea?
North Sea.
North Sea.
And I just think when you talked about educating young students and bringing more environmental programs into universities, how do we educate the older generation who's in charge? We have the same problem in this country.
Yeah. Well, I think, I guess all I can say on that is that, one of our fundamental problems as a society is that we can't take the long view. We only take the short view. The next election, what's coming, and we're hardwired for that, of course. We're hardwired to sort of survive. But these problems are kind of long-term problems, and they're not amenable to easy fixes, and they need a kind of consistency of application to be dealt with in a sensible way. And that's, I think, the hardest thing for us to do.
We have one more question, and there's...
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if Mrs. Mellon influenced the garden in the indoor garden at the Museum of Natural History of American Art in Washington.
Interesting question as to whether there are these, internal gardens at the National Gallery. I don't know whether she did. To be quite honest, I don't know. I kind of suspect not. Not at least not in the old wing of the National Gallery. And the new wing was very much Paul Mellon's project later in life. And I don't know about the plantings around there. I don't think of it as being particularly interesting in terms of planting. So I suspect not. That's the answer there.
So I think we're done. Can we do one more? I want this right
poor lady here who's been trying to get our attention.
She's been trying.
I think it's,
You can talk loud.
here it comes. Here comes the microphone.
Wait till the mic arrives. You said that she preferred European pasture grasses. Did you keep European pasture grasses, or what's the difference in that and North American pasture grasses?
Yeah, so really those European pasture grasses were brought in by the horse operation for feeding the thoroughbreds. So it was really Paul Mellon rather than her. I've come to learn a little bit about this. I don't pretend to understand it really well, but what I do know is that it's very hard to get the native vegetation reestablished on an area where you've had cold season grasses, because as the winter warms up, those cold season grasses take off like a shot, and they're up and smothering everything else that comes up traditionally much more slowly here in North America. So the whole trick is to slow them down. And so, there are various ways you can do it. You can spray them with Roundup, which kills them, and you got to spray them several times to really kill them. Then you start with a blank slate, or you can try other methods. I don't think burning is good to start with, because grasses are used to being burned. That's not so great. We have found that constant mowing will slow them down. But then you have to think about the birds, because the birds are starting to nest in May, and you'd really like to keep mowing to keep those European pasture grasses back. So it's tricky. And that's why, in a way, managing the estate is so interesting, but also why it's so challenging. Oh yeah, we've still got them. We've got
Everything.
690 acres of them.